Many girls dream of becoming princesses and living in a magical castle when they are children. Elsie and Eva fulfilled their dream, but they forgot that fairy tales have not only handsome princes, but also villains. Before we dive into the investigation, let's go back a few centuries. What comes to mind when you think of the world of Disney? Most people probably think of Cinderella's castle in the Magic Kingdom. This magical structure is indeed the main logo of the Walt Disney Animation Company. This fairy tale castle, which stands at the center of the theme park, has something fascinating about it. When you first see the carved towers and stone decorations, you realize that you have left the real world behind. However, few people know that Cinderella's castle was inspired by real and fictional castles. One of these castles is Neuschwanstein Castle, located on a rocky hill at the foot of the Alps in the far south of Germany. It was commissioned by King Ludwig II, and this building has a history that is far from fairy tale-like. Although Ludwig II was sometimes called the fairy tale king, most people considered him mad. He ascended the throne in 1864 at the age of 18. The young man did not like formal social events or participating in state affairs. Instead, he preferred a life of seclusion, with true interests in art, music, and architecture. One day, the king decided to flee from everyone else and build his small fairy tale castle on the edge of a 92-meter-high rock. Ludwig's fantasies originated from his childhood when he was a little boy fascinated by medieval legends. After becoming king, he decided to fulfill his dream and build a castle in the style of medieval knights' castles. King personally led the construction project, constantly making changes and spending vast sums of money. At that time, the country was involved in hostilities, but Ludwig was only interested in his own fantasies. For his descendants, he remained a mystery. At night, he dressed in medieval clothes and walked in the mountains to admire his work from afar. The castle was supposed to have 200 rooms, including the king's apartments, a throne room, a theater with a large stage, and the servants' quarters. From the outside, Neuschwanstein consists of several separate buildings adorned with numerous towers, gables, balconies, and sculptures. All this splendor was never completed. The king moved into the unfinished castle and spent only 172 days there. In June 1886, he was declared insane and deposed from the throne. 3 days later, Ludwig II and his doctor went for a walk and were never seen again. Their bodies were later found in a nearby lake. For historians, it remains a mystery whether it was foul play or the king's decision to commit suicide. 2 months after King Ludwig II's death, Neuschwanstein Castle was open to the public for a fee to repay the numerous loans taken out to build this extraordinary structure. Since then, Neuschwanstein has become one of the world's biggest tourist attractions, especially in Germany. The castle has already been visited by more than 61 million people, with over 1 million tourists visiting each year, and even more in the summer months. Everyone wants to see the real-life Cinderella castle. Despite its strange history, it is truly beautiful. The best view of the majestic structure is from the Marienbrücke, which crosses the Polat Gorge at a height of 92 meters. Below, a waterfall rushes its water through a massive ravine, and behind the bridge begins the so-called Kingsway. From there, Neuschwanstein is well visible, and standing at that height, one has a breathtaking view of the surrounding landscape. The rocky facade, round towers, and slender balconies of the castle give an impression of magic. It is hard to imagine that this creation was made by human hands. Prototype is about twice as large as Cinderella's castle in Disneyland. In 2023, the beautiful surroundings of Neuschwanstein became a crime scene. News reported that 2 Asian tourists from Illinois, USA, were allegedly attacked and thrown off a cliff. This did not happen in a creepy fairy tale, but in real life. Although more than 6 months have passed since the tragedy, the media still report little about the incident. The trial is not yet complete, and the hearing is scheduled to take place in Germany. It is already known what happened in a place that is always busy, and the story has already shocked many people. The Marienbrücke, named after the king's mother, was originally made of wood. In 1866, it was replaced by metal structures. Ludwig II admired his creation alone from here. Today, the bridge is always crowded. There is an interesting detail. Newlyweds like to hang lovelocks on this bridge. The castle itself is undoubtedly beautiful, but there are no romantic stories associated with it. King Ludwig II avoided women all his life, categorically refused to marry, and devoted himself to art and dreams. Although much more has been said about the king, it is known for sure that he led a reclusive life. From this bridge, one has a beautiful panoramic view of the Cinderella Castle. On June 14, 2023, a Wednesday at 11 a.m., many people were already waiting their turn, although it was midweek. Tourists stood shoulder to shoulder in line to photograph the castle from the best angle. Among the many people with phones in hand were two young Asian American women, 22-year-old Kelsey Zhang and 21-year-old Ava Liu from Illinois. The women patiently waited their turn to go on this famous bridge. There are many hiking trails around the castle, but the best spot for photos is, of course, the Marienburg. People squeezed past each other just to get a good photo of their trip. It did not bother anyone that there were some unknown faces in the background of the photo. Everyone wanted to admire the peculiar castle and take home many new impressions, because in real life, the building looked even more beautiful than in the pictures on the internet. Eva and Kelsey walked along various paths around the castle, breathing in the fresh mountain air and listening to tourists from different countries speaking their languages. All this added more mystique to the place and immersed them in the atmosphere of a magical fairy tale. There was an incredible energy, and many different groups were on the move. Families with children, couples in love, groups of young men and women. As Eva and Kelsey roamed around the castle looking for the perfect shot, they heard a man's voice addressing them. The man asked if the friends were American. The man seemed to be a typical American tourist. He wore sneakers, a dark t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. He had a small goatee and a beaming smile that instantly made him likable. Among many people, it is easy to recognize people from different countries even without knowing their language. These are, of course, all stereotypes, but nevertheless, the Chinese are generally energetic and loud and travel in large groups. Americans are smiling and outgoing. Such features make it easy for people from the same country to recognize their fellow citizens in large crowds. Kelsey and Eva turned to the man in his 30s and confirmed that they were indeed from America. The man brightened up even more and said he was from Michigan. They had a casual, non-binding conversation. The man behaved quite naturally. He did not ask intrusive questions, but seemed genuinely happy to meet tourists from his country. When traveling abroad, there is a certain feeling of camaraderie when dealing with strangers from your own country. In any case, the man seemed very nice. He knew Germany well, as he said he had traveled a lot. The man told the young women about the most popular places in this country that are definitely worth a visit. He described the national dishes and assured them that they must taste them to enjoy the atmosphere of Germany. The man did not hesitate to offer to show them a secret spot from which you can get the best view of Neuschwanstein Castle and where there are hardly any tourists. This tempting opportunity to photograph without any faces in the background was very interesting for the women. The man explained that a local had shown him this part of the path on his last visit. It is hardly known to foreigners. They hesitated a bit, but when they looked around, they decided there was no reason to worry. The sun was shining outside, children were running and laughing, and numerous tour groups were walking around. In the summer months, about 6,000 people visited the castle daily. The special thing about the hiking trails around Neuschwanstein Castle is that there has never been a fatal accident despite the apparent danger. It was frightening because of the height, as the area is surrounded by mountains and sharp rocks, but otherwise, the tour was quite safe. Even if there was an unexpected situation, the friends could always run away or call for help because there were many people nearby. The man was also nice and friendly to them, did not seem threatening. Kelsey and Eva followed their new acquaintance up the footpath, the little-known viewpoint. Around 2:30 p.m., they stood at a small curve hidden by dense trees. Due to the natural curve, it was difficult to see what lay ahead and what was behind. At this point, the man's behavior changed completely. From a nice guy, he instantly turned into a real monster. Kelsey walked a bit ahead when she heard a scream. When she turned around, she saw the man trying to brutally assault her friend. She ran toward her compatriot, let Eva fall to the ground, and began pulling him away. It worked. The man let go of Eva, raised his hands to show he was giving up, stood where he was. Kelsey hoped that now he would realize that they would not be easy to deal with, that they would start screaming and calling for help, and that he would have to retreat anyway. But instead of running away, he turned his attention to Kelsey. He wrapped his arms around her neck and began squeezing with all his might, push her to the edge of the cliff. The woman gasped as she tried to pull the man's hands away from her neck. She did not notice that she was getting closer to the cliff step by step. When she was only a few centimeters from the edge, the stranger simply pushed her back with all his might. Elsie Zhang flew 50 meters down. That's the same as throwing someone off a balcony on the 15th floor. The worst part was the rocky side of the cliff, and the person who fell could easily land on a sharp rock or fall even further to the bottom of the ravine. The man then turned to Eva and tried to rip her clothes off to abuse her. She was in shock at what had just happened, but did not want to give up without a fight. The young woman fought back as best she could, scratching his face and leaving bright red welts on his cheeks and forehead. Eva met the same fate as her friend. The attacker hit her with all his might and threw her down the rocky slope. She fell to the ground next to her friend. For some unknown reason, total stranger decided that he had the right to use the women for a brief pleasure and to satisfy his base instincts, and then threw them away, something unnecessary. When the news of this case spread later, it sparked a strong reaction from internet users. People were so outraged by the man's impudence that they offered to do the same to him. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. So who is this man who took the lives of others? Troy Bowling was known in his neighborhood for walking his cat on a leash. The 30-year-old man's favorite activity was walking in Lincoln Park, Michigan, where he lived with his brother. He was a quiet, unremarkable man about whom few people knew anything. None of the neighbors ever talked to him because he showed no interest in conversation. When Troy sat on the porch of his house, he carefully averted his gaze from passers-by so as not to attract attention. It was known that he had been briefly arrested for fraud in 2016, but this charge was eventually dropped. He spent his free time at his computer, playing Dungeons & Dragons. He could go unseen for weeks, and no one knew if he was home or away. In general, no one was very interested in the man. Troy also chatted with several women on the internet and told them how much he liked Asian women. Corresponded with a lady from Thailand. They met in a video game and quickly found a common language. To his online girlfriend, he seemed like a nice, very sincere guy. While in the mountains, he constantly sent her messages and pictures of the castle panorama. She never noticed any signs of abnormal behavior in him. Then he sent her an ominous photo of two people crouching on a small platform overlooking the castle. The place seemed secluded enough. Judging by this photo, he probably scouted the area in advance to look for secluded spots hidden from tourists. Troy had been talking to the Thai woman till the moment he tried to attack the two Asian students. Eva Liu never dreamed of a fairy tale prince. She knew from a young age what she wanted. She worked tirelessly to achieve her goal, relying only on herself. She had a twin sister named Alice. They both wore the same clothes and often performed the same trick at family gathering. One sister played the piano with her left hand and the other with her right. Despite their striking similarities, the sisters had completely opposite personalities. Alice was as shy as Eva was sociable. They both grew up in Canada and then moved to the United States. Eva was successful in one of the country's most prestigious programs, studying computer science at the University of Illinois, which ranks 5th nationwide in computer science. Before starting her first real job in July, Eva spoke to one of her best friends, Kelsey Zhang, and they traveled together to Europe. The young women knew they had careers ahead of them, and could not foresee when they would next go on vacation together. Kelsey was originally from Blooming, Illinois. She too graduated in May and received her bachelor's degree in computer engineering. Together with Eva, she devoted herself entirely to her studies to secure her future and deserved 3 weeks of relaxation and new experiences. The women carefully thought out and planned their travel route. They deliberately chose popular places with many tourists, which to some extent ensured their safety. The first stop was Budapest, then Vienna, Prague, and Germany. Their last travel destination before returning home was to visit Cinderella's famous Neuschwanstein Castle. Kelsey Zhang and Eva Liu spent their last night in a twin room on the ground floor of a cheap hotel. They had breakfast together, packed their things, and put them in the luggage room to pick up after their trip. Along with other visitors, they took the bus to the castle. On the same day, around 3 p.m., the castle visitors standing on the Marienbrücke suddenly noticed a bright red helicopter circling the sky over the ravine. One by one, the tourists turned their heads towards the steep slope a little further along the footpath. They all lost interest in the old castle they had been so eager to photograph moments earlier. Now they were more interested in what had happened. They directed their cameras towards the helicopter and tried to zoom in to see the area at the foot of the mountain. Suddenly, someone spotted 2 girls lying on the steep rock face, one of them wearing a light blue top, moving and clinging to a fallen tree while the other lay motionless on the ground. The crowd began whispering in their native languages. At that moment, the helicopter hovered in the air and rescuers began descending from it on a rope. They landed on a heavily wooded rocky cliff. It seems that the mission to rescue the 2 women was very difficult and dangerous due to the inaccessible location where the students were. Regular rescue vehicles could not reach them. The only way to get to them was from the air, carried out by a special rescue team in the Alps. Meanwhile, people wondered how the 2 women ended up on the steep slope and immediately began sharing their observations. Some hikers saw them walking with a man on the trail. But where had he gone? When one of the girls was brought into the helicopter, she was seen moving. It was Kelsey Zhang. Her fall was broken by the massive branches of a tree, which saved her life. The mountain rescuers lifted Eva Liu to the top, while the shocked tourists watched with their mouths open. As soon as Kelsey was in the helicopter, she immediately said that a man had pushed them both off the cliff and had previously tried to assault Eva. All exits of the hiking trail were immediately sealed off. 25 emergency vehicles were dispatched to the scene. The suspect fled the scene but was soon captured after a large-scale police operation and brought to the police station in the neighboring town of Füssen. Identifying the perpetrator was not difficult, because Eva Liu made sure he did not escape justice. His face was literally marked by the woman's fingernails, covered in bright red scratches, making him stand out in the crowd. Kelsey survived the 50-meter fall. Branches of a tree had cushioned the impact, helping her survive. The young woman suffered only minor, non-life-threatening injuries, just a few bruises and scratches and a bleeding superficial head wound. Kelsey was otherwise fine and was discharged from the hospital on Saturday. Eva Liu landed a few meters away from her friend, flat on the ground, but her fall trajectory was slightly different. There was no tree to prevent her from hitting the rocky cliffside. That was the difference between life and death. When the rescuers arrived, Eva was unresponsive. She was taken to the hospital, but died later that night. Eva was only 21 years old. She remained in the hospital morgue while her parents flew in from another continent, pick up their daughter's body, and bring it back to the United States. The family brought Eva's body home on Father's Day, June 18, 2023. Her father said it was the most painful day of his life. The greatest injustice was that German prisoners probably lived better than the average free American citizen. They serve their time in rooms that resemble hotel rooms rather than prison cells. They sleep on regular beds, and guards are instructed to knock before entering the prisoners' rooms. It is forbidden to eavesdrop on prisoners' phone calls, as this is considered a violation of privacy laws. Some are even allowed to leave the prison to spend time with their families, depending on the severity of their crime. Most German prisons are more like holiday homes with some restrictions. This was also the case for Troy, a man who intentionally threw two innocent young women off a cliff, one of whom died. The man was arrested and charged with premeditated murder, attempted murder, harassment. Instead of being extradited to his homeland and serving time in an American prison, this man will enjoy all the benefits of civilization in Germany, because the crime took place in this country. Germany also has very strict privacy laws when it comes to court proceedings. For this reason, the suspect's data were kept confidential. However, once the name of the alleged perpetrator became known in the USA, journalists pounced on his family, trying to get information about this man. Relatives mostly refused to comment, and acquaintances and classmates described him as a strange, withdrawn, and very quiet guy who did not show aggression. So what could have driven him to attack young women? There are still many rumors on the internet about Troy's abnormal behavior towards Asian women. Apparently, he felt superior to them and prioritized his own desires, deciding that the students should be submissive to him. For some reason, he treated women of other races like lifeless objects, dolls, and if they dared to resist, simply discarded them as if they did not matter. The police are currently looking for all video recordings of the incident. Since many visitors to Neuschwanstein are foreign tourists, it may take a long time to gather information. Officially, the motives for the attack have not yet been confirmed, as the details of the incident are still being reconstructed. But no matter how the case ends, nothing will bring back the life of the young, promising Eva Liu. Talented young woman, and a wonderful friend. Her loss will leave a lasting wound in the souls of not only her parents, but all who knew her. Thank you for watching, and take care of yourself.
Sometimes the burdens of everyday life weigh us down to the ground. It's good when there are people you can lean on who offer understanding and support, because if that is not the case, everything can end very tragically. Anli Lebensstegen was born on April 5, 1959 in Poland. She was born in the city of Bialystok, where she also spent her childhood. At a more conscious age, Anne moved. She wanted to broaden her horizons and start a new life here. The young woman decided to settle in the big city of Mississauga in the province of Ontario. Mississauga is the sixth largest city in Canada. It is considered multicultural, and its main attraction is a large park bordering Lake Ontario. There is a sandy beach, and overall it is very beautiful there. It was precisely here that one day she met a man named Mr. Karubin. His name is kept secret for security reasons. The couple married, and Anne took her husband's surname. In 1987, their first daughter Caroline was born. A year later, Catherine followed. The woman became a housewife, took care of the household and the children, while her husband worked and provided for the family. Although the married couple gave the appearance of a happy family to the outside world, it turned out that the man had no particular interest in taking care of the children. He quickly grew bored of family life. The older the girls got, the more disagreements arose between the spouses. Finally, they decided to get a divorce. For Anne, this was a difficult time as her husband detached himself from his children. To oblige him to pay alimony, she had to go to court. The case dragged on. The young mother faced obvious difficulties, including financial and moral ones. To make ends meet, she primarily needed work. At one point, she even had 2 jobs simultaneously from morning till evening with no days off. That was, of course, extremely exhausting. Despite her diligence, the money was barely enough for 3 people, and she had no strength left to fully fulfill her duties as a mother. Caroline and Catherine spent a lot of time without their mother during this period, as she was constantly at work. They missed her greatly and hoped that the woman would overcome all these difficulties and that everything would be good again. Unfortunately, the situation only worsened. The divorce dragged on for a very long time. affairs fell into disarray. Anne fell into a depression. It became unbearably difficult and lonely for her. All of that began to break her. The situation was worsened by the fact that she was in a foreign country and could not even see her relatives to confide in them. She wanted to find a new man, get married, secure his support, but she didn't even have time for the children, let alone a private life. Anne couldn't even find friends here, as that also required time, which she completely lacked. Instead, Anne found solace in alcohol. She began to drink a little after work to fall asleep faster and relax. A great relief and hope for her was meeting a man named Dark. They met and began seeing each other at one of Anne's workplaces. Gradually, the woman introduced her friend to her daughters. He seemed a worthy man and partner for the future, so they decided to marry. At first, everything went well, and Anne decided that she had finally found her happiness and her life would return to its familiar tracks. In the first year of their marriage, Anne gave birth to Robert. From then on, the relationship became more tense. It was precisely in marriage that Dark's bad character traits, such as aggressiveness and lack of self-control, showed. He constantly got drunk, lost his temper, took his anger out on his wife, and behaved quite unpredictably, so much so that even Caroline and Catherine had to intervene to protect their mother from beatings. The worst part was that the man targeted not only his wife but also the girls and laid hands on them. Anne continued to seek solace in alcohol and drank more and more. Soon, she became dependent on it. However, when drunk, she was not aggressive but simply fell asleep immediately. In such moments, Dark would take advantage of the situation, mock her, and according to the sisters, raped her multiple times. This went on for quite some time before the mother found out what was happening. As soon as Anne spoke about it, Dark attacked her, beat her, and threatened her. Initially, she simply didn't know what to do in this situation. Despite her children's complaints, Anne did not want to separate from her husband, as she was panicky, afraid of plunging back into the darkness of poverty, loneliness, and depression. The older daughter took matters into her own hands and tried by all means to obtain justice and stop the violence, but no one listened to her or did anything. This couldn't go on forever, especially since Dark was becoming increasingly brutal. Finally, in 2001, they succeeded in convicting the man for domestic violence. An additional charge for drunk driving was also added. This was, of course, far from the accusations of sexual abuse he had committed at home. The sisters felt it was unjust what this man had done to the girls, but all statements and demands were simply ignored by the police. Caroline and Catherine were at least glad they had managed to isolate this dangerous man and that he no longer posed a threat to them. In any case, they perceived this as the beginning of a new life. Anne was left alone again with her 3 children. The older daughters placed great hopes in their mother at that time. They believed that she would pull herself together, stop drinking, and put her life in order. However, they were all very traumatized by the difficult relationship. Anne, too. During this time, the woman began to drink even more than before. This significantly worsened the situation. She could no longer control her addiction. All the money she earned from several jobs was spent on alcohol. The girls knew their mother needed help but could do nothing. At least they were teenagers by then and could take good care of themselves and their little brother. That eased their situation somewhat, but they sorely missed their mother's attention. With growing up came even more disagreements. The girls constantly argued with her, making the atmosphere in the house tense. They argued constantly. The situation worsened further when both schoolgirls tried alcohol and forbidden substances. Of course, they had no other role model in life, only incapable and dependent parents who, as they themselves said, were failures. The girls expressed themselves very negatively about their mother. As they entered a difficult puberty, the sisters began to skip school. The situation at home became increasingly tense. People around them noticed how much the girls suffered from their standard of living. They themselves looked at their peers and noticed that their friends had a nice home, nice clothes, delicious food, and were loved by their parents. Caroline and Catherine had none of that. Even dinner with their mother did not resemble a cozy get-together. The family members had grown very distant from each other. Some acquaintances supported the sisters. They gave them food and provided them with various things, but all that was not enough for the teenage girls to feel normal. At the same time, Anne's daughters were very intelligent, energetic, and active. Their teachers described their intelligence as above average. They were successful at school and understood that the only way out of poverty was to get a good education and later find a good job. In reality, however, they dreamed of being popular and wearing fashionable clothes like other girls who had no problems with their parents. But the behavior of these children also had something disturbing about it. Some teachers noticed that Catherine and Caroline had a real talent for manipulating people. They easily got what they wanted from their classmates, and if they themselves did something wrong, they usually got away with it. Later, the girls dropped out of school altogether. As they grew older, their dissatisfaction with their mother grew more and more. Soon this led to the sisters developing a veritable hatred for Anne. They openly said that she was a useless mother who only thought of herself in the bottle. The girls turned to relatives, their father and colleagues, but no one did anything to help them. The negative attitude towards their mother grew and intensified. In 2002, they could no longer bear to watch Anne ruin herself in them. A frightening plan matured in the teenage girls' minds. At this point, Caroline was 15 years old and Catherine was 14. This, however, did not stop them from devising a plan for a bloody act of revenge. The daughters wanted to help their mother, but in a very twisted way. Their main goal was to free her from her suffering. They wanted to do this to gain popularity and profit themselves. The teenagers knew that Anne had taken out a life insurance policy for $200,000. The protagonist of the story had taken this out as soon as the opportunity arose at her work in case something should happen to the woman. This way she secured herself and provided for the next generation. But the girls did not want to wait. They decided that it was time to begin an independent life. The sisters knew they would not get the money if it were proven that Anne had died by their hand. Therefore, the plan had to be carefully worked out. Thus arose a school project titled, How to Kill Your Mother. At first, even the teenagers themselves took the whole thing more as a joke. They told their classmates about it and even wanted to win over like-minded people who would help them find the best method to kill the woman. These showed interest. They constantly discussed various details of the murder so that everything would succeed for them. Caroline and Catherine began to socialize with other young people and discussed everything openly in a group they had founded specifically for this. The friends looked for possibilities. Initially, a pistol or a knife was considered. Since they wanted no bloodshed and no suffering of the victim, they came to the conclusion that the most painless and simplest method to kill their mother was drowning. For some reason, they considered this simplest method which they could carry out quickly and uncomplicatedly without leaving traces. Naturally, all of this was discussed intensively with classmates. Caroline and Catherine presented everything as a game. As long as they could win over many young people for the elaboration of a bloody murder plan who did not even understand that it was about planning a real crime and that the sisters wanted to do this to their mother. Nevertheless, everything quickly developed into a serious planning of a crime. The girls could not stop. Drowning had already been chosen as the ideal murder method. They began to discuss this with their classmates, hoping to understand what difficulties they could expect, how to divert police suspicion from themselves and avoid punishment. They also talked about other topics. They were particularly interested in how they could guaranteed get the money from the insurance policy. The sisters planned to receive $200,000 for their mother's life and discussed vividly with their classmates what they wanted to buy with this money. The schoolgirls wanted to buy a new cozy house and set up a whole plantation of forbidden plants there. With the first harvest and the sale of the illegal substances, Caroline and Catherine wanted to travel through Europe with friends. In particular, they wanted to visit Amsterdam. Ultimately, the sisters devoted a lot of attention to this plan. It seemed truly worked out to the smallest detail. On the evening of January 11, 2003, Caroline and Catherine finally decided to kill their mother, but disagreements arose with their like-minded peers because a party among teenagers was planned for the same day. Everyone feared that the celebration might be canceled because of the murder. It seemed incredible that the students still did not take the sisters' plans seriously. Anyway, they managed to postpone the deed by 1 week to January 18. On that Saturday morning, the daughters, contrary to their habit, went straight to their mother and offered her a bottle of vodka. Anne was very pleased by this attention and had no idea that her death sentence was to be carried out. The daughters poured her one glass after another and at the same time put the forbidden substance into each glass. It was a painkiller that slows the heartbeat and in combination with alcohol can have very dangerous effects. The sisters' goal, however, was not to poison their mother. They didn't even hide particularly from their mother. Anne saw that her daughters were giving her tablets but willingly took them along with strong alcohol because she believed it would help her. All of this happened literally live. Caroline and Catherine constantly wrote to their friends via Messenger about how far the process had progressed. When the vodka bottle was empty, Anne was very drunk and sleepy. The schoolgirls informed their classmates that it was time to get rid of their mother. One boy even wished them good luck and gave them a final piece of advice. They should put on rubber gloves. The girls followed his advice and actually used protective gloves. Logically, this made one of their classmates an accomplice to the crime they intended to commit, but no one seemed aware of the gravity of the situation. At this point, Anne was feeling worse and worse. The tablets combined with the alcohol began to take effect and the effect intensified. Finally, the girls suggested she take a relaxing bath and get a massage. She agreed. The daughters helped their mother get up. She could barely stand, so it took them about half an hour to get to the bathroom, which by then was filled with water. Then the older daughter said that her mother needed a back massage and therefore should turn onto her stomach. Obviously, the woman in this state could not think clearly and immediately complied with this absurd request. At that moment, the older daughter began to drown her. Anne tried to resist but could not free herself from her older daughter and could not defend herself. She pushed with all her might against the bottom of the bathtub with her hands, but she didn't have enough strength to lift herself up and get air. The younger daughter also helped kill her mother. The sisters were of the opinion that one must deprive a person of air for 4 minutes for them to drown. Catherine stood by and counted the time, occasionally supporting her sister. When Caroline let go of her mother, she naturally showed no signs of life. The younger sister was so glad the plan had worked that she even screamed with joy. Afterward, the teenagers wrote in the group that the project had succeeded. Now it was a matter of covering their tracks and diverting suspicion from themselves. But this was also carefully planned. The daughters arranged to meet friends at the restaurant Jack Astor's, which was not far away. The other teenagers were probably already there to later confirm the minor's alibi. Caroline and Catherine calmly composed themselves, left their mother's corpse in the bathroom, and set off to meet their classmates. The first toast was to the successful murder of their mother. The schoolgirls spent several hours there and then made their way home. A few minutes after their return, a call came into the emergency call center. The weeping girls reported that they had found the corpse of their mother Anne in the bathtub. The ambulance that was called tried to revive the woman. Naturally, this was unsuccessful as Anne had already been lying in the water for several hours. The police were also on the scene. The sisters behaved like children, were obviously traumatized by their loss, cried incessantly, and seemed inconsolable. Interestingly, they had even rehearsed this tragicomedy with a classmate who was in a theater club. Everything had been very carefully prepared and carried out. From the outside, it looked as if the drunk mother had simply fallen asleep in the bathroom and drowned. It looked like an accident, but the experience of the police officers told them that not everything had gone so smoothly. Investigators generally rarely deal with drowning cases. Usually, adults don't die this way, but rather small children who have been left unsupervised. Therefore, it seemed strange that an adult woman who was also heavily intoxicated had gotten into the bathtub at all. Why? How could she even get there? Undress and climb in without falling and hitting her head in that condition, everything seemed illogical. Nevertheless, the sisters had planned everything well. They had even left the glass from which their mother had been drinking in the bathroom to strengthen the police's suspicion of an accident. They managed to arrange everything so that no traces of a struggle remained. Of course, no one had broken into the house either, so there were no strangers inside. No one had suspected bribery or the age of the perpetrators, of course. Who would have expected that desperate teenagers were capable of drowning a close person? In any case, the police had to speak with Caroline and Catherine to clarify all details. The two sisters told an emotional story about how they had found their mother lifeless when they returned from the restaurant where they had been with friends. They admitted that Anne had been drinking when they left the house, but that was nothing unusual as she had been alcohol dependent for years. The woman had never been aggressive but had rather tried to distract herself from her exhausting workdays and private problems. According to their account, the teenagers returned around 10:30 p.m., immediately discovered their mother's corpse, and called 911. The dispatcher instructed them on how to behave until the ambulance arrived. The girls pulled their mother out of the bathtub and began CPR, but it was all in vain. Now it had to be decided where Caroline and Catherine would live until they came of age. The girls' younger brother, Robert, was with his father at that time. He was only 3 years old. Thanks to his sisters, the boy was doomed to grow up without a mother. The detectives, meanwhile, worked at the scene of the alleged accident. First, the time of the woman's death had to be determined to understand if Anne had really been alone in the house. They relied on the water temperature for this. The water in the bath had long since cooled to room temperature. This indicated that Anne had died at least a few hours before her discovery. No signs of violence could be found on the woman's corpse. However, the children did not manage to commit such a perfect crime that they remained undetected. The medical examiner determined that traces of desperate attempts to rise out of the water and get air were visible on the victim's body. Anne seemed to have struggled with someone holding her down. Barely visible marks were found on her fingertips. Furthermore, the woman had tried so hard to save herself that she had torn off several fingernails. Nevertheless, after the toxicological examination, all police doubts were dispelled. A lethal dose of alcohol was found in the woman's body, so her death was immediately recognized as an accidental drowning under the influence of alcohol. The investigation was closed and the aunt took Caroline and Catherine in and became their guardian. As planned by the girls, they received the money from their mother's life insurance, part of which benefited their younger brother, who remained with their father. It seemed as if this originally joking school project had become the perfect crime. This time, only chance could expose the criminals. Caroline and Catherine simply could not keep quiet about their success. The information about their deeds spread among more and more people. They showed not the slightest remorse. They boasted that they had not only killed Anne but had gotten the money and had even escaped justice. Now they wanted to realize their dream of buying a nice house and filling it with forbidden plants, but the ambitious schoolgirls did not manage to realize their new grand project. 11 months after the death, a friend of Caroline's went to the police to report the murderers. She had known from the beginning, but only now was her conscience tormenting her so much that she could no longer sleep. The friend revealed the truth about the planning and preparation of the crime, which had taken place online. She granted investigators access to her computer where all dialogues were recorded. The police could not only see how this plan had been hatched, but also found numerous confessions from each of the sisters. The investigators, however, were of the opinion that they needed something more substantial. Therefore, they decided to use the friend to obtain new evidence. Listening and recording devices were installed in her car. Now the perpetrators only had to be convicted by their own voices. That was actually quite simple because Caroline and Catherine could literally talk about nothing else but the murder, even almost a year later. One only had to broach the subject and they would begin describing the course of the crime and their high qualities as murderers. Even 11 months after the cold-blooded murder, they continued to willingly talk about this event, still with obvious pride and without remorse. Because of this, there were several dozen witnesses who had heard the sisters' confessions. Up to that point, however, hardly anyone had taken the schoolgirls' stories seriously. Now their talkativeness allowed the details of the heinous plan to be reconstructed. In particular, the sisters immediately mentioned the tablets which had not been found in the first toxicological examination. The test simply had not been conducted fully. After the lethal alcohol dose was detected in the blood, everything else was dismissed as irrelevant. Finally, everything came to light, and on January 21, 2004, at 7 a.m., the police stood at the aunt's doorstep, where Catherine and Caroline lived. Both girls were arrested and taken to the police station in their pajamas. They were still sleeping. Furthermore, the main suspects' computers were seized. During interrogations, both denied their guilt and tried with all their might to portray themselves as innocent, which completely matched the behavior pattern of manipulators. They even refused to wear the clothes offered to them by the police. Both remained in their pajamas. This was probably meant to reinforce the impression of their innocence. Naturally, no one believed them. Under the pressure of evidence, the older daughter Caroline was quickly broken. She broke into tears and confessed to having killed her mother. Interestingly, however, they failed to break her younger sister Catherine. She withstood hours of police interrogations and continued to insist on her innocence. By this time, however, investigators had recovered the sisters' browser history and correspondence, which had previously been deleted from the computers. This allowed new shocking details of the cold-blooded crime to be uncovered. The investigators reviewed all the correspondence provided by the witness. It was obvious that the sisters were dissatisfied with Anne's alcohol addiction. Even from these data carriers, enough evidence was gathered to charge the sisters with premeditated murder. When rumors about this incident and those involved spread through the media, it shocked all of Canada. It involved two 16-year-old schoolgirls who had cold-bloodedly murdered a close person. Given the age of the accused, the country's juvenile justice system was activated. Interestingly, both were even released on bail and placed under house arrest until the trial. Finally, the trial began. Interestingly, the accused were allowed to wear the pajamas they had been arrested in during the initial phase. Many considered this an obvious manipulation of the jury to soften their attitude towards them. This, however, changed little. The prosecution presented two motives for the murder: the insurance money and the desire to break out of the vicious cycle with their alcoholic mother. According to the correspondence, they even saw it as a kind of liberation for their mother from her suffering. During the hearings, dozens of other students also appeared. They were all involved in the same project. They had taken on roles in the planning and given advice. Therefore, they could well have been considered accomplices. Ultimately, however, none of them were held accountable, as it was concluded that they were not aware of the gravity of Caroline and Catherine's intentions and believed it was merely a game. Given the carefully constructed evidence, Catherine and Caroline, of course, had no chance. Escaping punishment, they were found guilty of first-degree murder. For minors, however, the maximum sentence under these statutes was only 10 years imprisonment, of which they only had to spend 6 behind bars, while the remaining 4 were placed under house arrest. Due to good behavior, the older sister was released after 4 years in 2009. At that time, Caroline was 22 years old. Shortly afterward, Catherine, also 22, was released. Under Canadian law for the protection of the rights and privacy of minors, their names were not published in the media. However, it was not possible to keep this information secret for long, as the sisters spoke too openly about their terrible crime. The protection didn't work, their identities were uncovered. This, however, did not prevent the murderers from starting a new life. Both enrolled in college and received their diplomas. Catherine completed her law degree and got married. Caroline decided on a career in technology and became a scientist. Later, she became a single mother and fully recognized the difficulties her mother had struggled with back then. 17 years after the cold-blooded murder, in 2020, Caroline spoke with the media. At that time, she was 33 years old. The woman said that she had fundamentally reconsidered her deed and now regretted it every day. Today she sees Anne as a strong woman who tried everything to keep her family afloat but fell into depression due to endless financial problems and difficult relationships with men. She was traumatized just like her children. Only they could not comprehend the scale of events back then and decided to get rid of their undesirable mother. Thanks for watching and take care of yourself. On April 27, a man living near the city of Myrtle Beach went fishing on the Lumber River in the state park of the same name. It was a place he often visited because of its seclusion and peace. Unlike other popular recreational areas, Lumber River State Park offered silence, the opportunity to focus on nature, and a minimal presence of outsiders. The fishermen knew that such places were perfect for a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. On this day, the man settled down on the bank and chose a spot with dense vegetation. He prepared his equipment and began to enjoy the solitude, but soon his attention was drawn to a sound atypical for the surroundings. It was the muffled crying of a woman. It was not loud or panicked, but rather desperate and fitful. The sound came from the other side of the river, but the dense vegetation made it difficult to make out the source. The fisherman became suspicious, but decided not to intervene immediately so as not to violate privacy, and assumed that someone was just going through a difficult moment alone. A few minutes passed, the crying stopped. The man relaxed a little and dismissed what had happened as a random occurrence. He went back to fishing, but soon he heard a sharp sound that could not be confused with anything else. It was a gunshot. The sound immediately made him alert. The fisherman felt obliged to check what had happened and decided to approach the spot where the sounds came from. He covered about 200 m and waded through the dense vegetation until he came to a small spot on the bank. There, an unusual sight presented itself to him. A backpack lay on the ground, sunglasses and a mobile phone lay nearby. There were no people to be seen nearby. He examined the items but saw no signs of a struggle or blood. This increased his disquiet. The man decided to open the backpack in the hope of finding clues to the owner. Inside, he found a wallet with documents, cash, credit cards, small items, and a small Bible. What he found offered no clear explanation for what had happened. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, he immediately called the police. The police arrived about an hour later. After inspecting the site, they began to comb the area. Later in the day, another call came in from a park visitor who had come across something even more disturbing. Myrtle Beach on the Atlantic coast in South Carolina is known as a popular tourist destination. About 35,000 people live in the city. In the summer season, however, this number rises due to the large influx of vacationers. In addition to its tourist appeal, Myrtle Beach is also home to many churches that play an important role in the local community. Among them, the Solid Rock Church in the center of the city stands out. It was founded as a spiritual center for parishioners seeking a deep religious experience and support in difficult life situations. Solid Rock quickly made a name for itself by actively engaging with the local community and offering both traditional worship services and educational and sports activities for young people. Pastor John Paul Miller plays a key role in Solid Rock's activities. He was appointed in 2009 and has a background in religious work. John Paul was known for his charismatic manner and his active involvement in the lives of his parishioners. He was married to a woman named Allison, with whom he raised 3 children together and a child from a previous marriage. The Miller family lived in a house next to the church. That brought them even closer to the congregation. One of the new families that joined Solid Rock in the same year was the Francis family. The parents Angelita and Michael moved to Myrtle Beach together with their 2 daughters Micah and Sierra and chose this church to attend. For 14-year-old Micah, the church quickly became a place where she made new friends and actively participated in youth activities. She took part in a group organized by Pastor John Paul himself, which allowed her to become part of the local community. Micah's older sister Sierra was also active in Solid Rock. Her role, however, was less and less visible. Micah, on the other hand, stood out for her enthusiasm and her faith, which did not go unnoticed. Her involvement in church affairs opened up the opportunity for her to connect with other young parishioners. One of these young men was Jeremy, who participated in the same activities as Micah. Their relationship developed gradually, and after a few years, the young couple decided to marry. Their union seemed ideal, common interests in church activities and support from both families. But this union, which became part of the church history, was later to be at the center of complex events that changed the lives of everyone involved. The wedding took place in the church itself. John Paul performed the ceremony personally, underlining its importance for the congregation. The event was a real celebration that brought many parishioners together. The parents on both sides expressed their pride in the young couple and saw in their marriage the embodiment of the ideals of family and spiritual unity. At this time, Micah and Jeremy were full of hope for a shared future based on common goals and faith. After the wedding, Micah and Jeremy's lives became even more closely interwoven with the work of the church. Micah helped with administrative tasks, took care of paperwork and event management, while Jeremy focused on the youth sports programs. He led the American football team and was also involved in the development of other activities for young people. Through these tasks, they spent a lot of time together, and that seemed to be the perfect continuation of their marriage. But just a few months after the wedding, the first signs of strain in their relationship appeared. The frequent daily routines together, packed with responsibility, made Micah tired. And unlike the time before the wedding, when they could pay more attention to each other, their lives now revolved around work. Jeremy, absorbed in his role, spent less and less time supporting Micah emotionally, which increased her feeling of isolation. Another factor that affected their relationship was Micah's close relationship with other church members, including the pastor's wife Allison. During her work in the administrative office, Micah gradually took on more responsibility and became an integral part of the team. This led to her professional life beginning to overlap with her private life, leading to additional tensions in her marriage. Although their marriage looked good on the outside, internal problems were piling up. The couple did not share their difficulties with others in order to maintain the appearance of harmony. Nevertheless, the cracks in the relationship became visible to the people closest to them. These first signs of discord would later form the basis for more serious problems that would influence their fate. After a few months in administration, Micah was transferred to a new position and became the personal secretary of Pastor John Paul Miller. This decision was due to her organizational talent and her desire to take on more responsibility in church activities. The move to this position meant that she worked closely with John Paul, which meant frequent personal meetings and regular communication as part of her duties. With the start of her new task, Micah spent a lot of time by the pastor's side. John Paul appreciated her diligence and her interest in the affairs of the church. Despite their age difference of more than 10 years, their communication gradually went beyond the workplace. At first, there were discussions about personal views on life and faith. Later, they became more open conversations. This interaction led to a close emotional bond between them, which led to tensions in their family life. In 2016, the situation changed dramatically. John Paul's wife Allison came home unexpectedly earlier than usual and caught her husband in a compromising situation with Micah. This incident was the beginning of a major conflict in the Miller household. Allison demanded an explanation and a confrontation ensued between the spouses. When Allison learned of the incident, she also decided to inform Jeremy, Micah's husband. The consequences of this event affected not only both families, but also the church congregation. Although the parties agreed to remain silent about the details of what had happened, rumors about the affair began to spread in the community. Church staff and people close to the family noticed changes in the behavior of John Paul and Micah, as well as increasing tensions between them and their spouses. Despite attempts to maintain the appearance of normality, the conflict became increasingly apparent. Allison and Jeremy filed for divorce almost simultaneously. The process was difficult and painful for both parties. Allison left the church and moved with her children to another city to start a new life, far away from the events that had led to the failure of her marriage. Jeremy, for his part, ended his involvement in church activities and distanced himself completely from Solid Rock. A few months after the divorce proceedings were concluded, John Paul and Micah officially announced their relationship. They openly stated that they were now a couple, which triggered a new wave of discussions in the community. This was a heavy blow for many parishioners. The pastor, who had previously preached the values of family loyalty, found himself involved in a scandal that undermined his reputation and the trust of some parishioners. In 2017, a year after their relationship began, John Paul Miller and Micah officially married. The wedding took place in the Solid Rock Church, where John Paul continued to serve as pastor despite previous scandals. Close friends, family members, and parishioners attended the ceremony. The event was an attempt to restore the pastor's credibility and mitigate the negative impression in the community following the revelation of his affair with Micah. For Micah, this event meant not only a new chapter in her personal life, but also greater responsibility within the church. She officially became the pastor's wife, which automatically gave her the role of mentor and organizer in the congregation. Many parishioners saw this step as a chance to renew and strengthen the church, as well as an opportunity for John Paul to begin a new chapter without the mistakes of the past. Immediately after the wedding, Micah took on new duties at Solid Rock. In addition to administrative work, she actively participated in church programs and focused on organizing mission trips and charity events. One of her most important projects was trips to Kenya. With the help of donations, Micah organized the construction of schools where children were offered basic educational opportunities, including English and mathematics. In addition to this work, Micah began leading courses and workshops in the church itself. Her lectures covered the topics of family values, personal faith, and overcoming adversity. A particularly important topic for her was dealing with domestic violence. She shared her views on this topic publicly, which attracted not only the attention of the congregation, but also a wide audience on social media. She actively posted on her page about the importance of respectful relationships and the need to support victims of violence. Micah's commitment to these projects gradually restored John Paul's reputation. Although many in the community still criticized the pastor for his past behavior, his wife's activism helped create the image of a new, more sustainable and progressive church. Micah was a key figure for Solid Rock. Her initiatives aimed to inspire young people and involve them in religious and social life. Despite Micah's efforts to maintain a family and working relationship with John Paul, tensions in their marriage began to grow. Over time, it became clear that their union, which was originally based on mutual understanding, was in a serious crisis. One of the first signs of the deterioration of their relationship was frequent arguments caused by financial control. John Paul took complete control of the family bank accounts and restricted Micah's access to funds. He claimed he was doing this to protect their joint finances. For Micah, however, this was an additional source of stress. She felt deprived of her autonomy and independence, especially given her active role in the church and in mission projects. She also noticed that her contact with friends and family was becoming increasingly restricted. John Paul confronted her about her frequent visits to her family and accused her of interfering too much in matters that did not concern their marriage. He also began to monitor her phone calls and correspondence, so that Micah felt constantly watched. Added to the psychological manipulation were threats. Micah told her relatives that John Paul used her past mistakes and weaknesses as leverage. One of the most painful examples was the mention of personal photos that he threatened to publish if she tried to leave the family. These methods increased her fear and uncertainty about the possibility of ending the relationship. Against this background, Micah made attempts to escape her husband's control. She turned to her sister Sierra and informed her of her intention to divorce. Together, they visited a lawyer who began preparing the documents. At this stage, however, Micah encountered another obstacle. After the meeting with the lawyer, John Paul learned of her plans, which led to another scandal. He categorically refused to discuss the terms of the divorce and stated that their marriage must be preserved for the sake of the church's reputation. Since she refused to speak openly about it, Micah temporarily moved to her family to escape her husband's pressure. This time gave her a break from the tension and the opportunity to realize how serious the situation had become. However, after another conversation in which he promised to change his behavior, she soon returned to John Paul. Despite these promises, the problems continued. One of the most striking incidents reflecting the escalation of their conflict was the incident with Micah's car. She went to the police after discovering that all four tires of her car had been slashed, and a GPS tracker was located under the chassis. She was convinced that John Paul was responsible. Although no direct evidence of his involvement was found, his sudden appearance at the car repair shop only reinforced her suspicion. One day, John Paul insisted that Micah be admitted to a hospital because her behavior had become unpredictable. A doctor subsequently diagnosed a mental disorder and recommended treatment. Micah, on the other hand, argued that her recent actions served to defend her own freedom and were not the result of instability. After her discharge, she contacted the police, claiming John Paul had tried to use her hospitalization to deprive her of her autonomy. Micah's attempts to end the marriage met with serious obstacles. Despite the efforts of her family and her lawyer, the divorce process dragged on. John Paul continued to maintain control over her life, which made her situation even worse. April 27, 2024 was a turning point in this story. On this day, Micah left her house without informing her family or friends of her intentions. The subsequent events, reconstructed using surveillance images, phone records, and recovered evidence, revealed the sequence of actions that led to her death. The surveillance footage confirmed that Micah arrived at the gun store that morning. She appeared calm and confident, which was noted by the store employees. She chatted casually with the salesperson during the purchase and then left the store with a small case containing a handgun. The receipts confirmed that the gun had been purchased legally and paid for by her personally. She then drove toward Lumber River State Park. Her vehicle was recorded by surveillance cameras along the highway leading to this location. Data from her mobile phone showed that Micah performed several searches related to remote locations and parks before selecting a specific destination. This confirms that her actions were planned in advance. When Micah reached the park, she left her car in the parking lot and walked to the river. A short time later, she called emergency services from the riverbank. During the call, she stated that she was leaving the world voluntarily and asked that information about her location be passed on to relatives. A recording of the call, later made available by the police, confirmed the seriousness of her intentions. There was sadness in her voice, but no obvious signs of panic. Less than an hour after the call, a passerby fishing nearby heard shots. When police arrived at the scene, they found Micah's body on the riverbank and her belongings nearby, including a backpack with documents, a phone, a wallet, and a small Bible. The weapon used to fire the shot was found nearby in the water. An examination revealed that there were no fingerprints on the weapon. Based on the evidence, investigators concluded that the shot was fired by Micah herself. It was also confirmed that she had driven to the scene alone and that no persons were following her on the surveillance footage. In the official police report, the cause of death was listed as the intentional termination of one's own life. However, this conclusion raised questions from her family, who claimed that Micah showed no signs of depression and led an active lifestyle. They also pointed out that a few days before her death, she had tried to finalize her divorce proceedings, which they believed indicated that she wanted to start a new life. Despite the official explanation from law enforcement, Micah's tragic death caused a great public outcry and gave rise to numerous theories about the possible causes of the incident. The family's main argument was the information Micah shared with her sister shortly before her death. She spoke of pressure and manipulation by her husband John Paul. According to Sierra, Micah even warned that John Paul would be held responsible if anything happened to her. These words were substantiated by her diary, which was found in her apartment after her death. The diary contained detailed entries about her complicated relationship with John Paul. Micah spoke of emotional and psychological abuse, constant control, and threats. She also pointed out that John Paul was prone to manipulation, often using her past mistakes against her and threatening to reveal personal information if she decided to leave him. Furthermore, the family and the community pointed to the uncovered information about John Paul, including his possible relationships with other women in the church and financial irregularities. Some parishioners claimed that the pastor may have embezzled funds he had collected for missions and used them for personal enrichment. This triggered numerous rumors and conspiracy theories. The alleged motives of John Paul were actively discussed on social media and media channels. His past actions, such as using a GPS tracker to spy on Micah and possibly pressuring her by threatening to publish personal photos, intensified the criticism of him. Some internet users accused him of indirectly causing the tragedy, while others put forward more radical theories about a staged crime. Although there was no direct evidence, the allegations against John Paul attracted the attention of the police and the public. These events made him the center of public condemnation, even though officials found no grounds for charges against him. The influence of Micah's family and the details of her life that came to light further fueled interest in the case and created an atmosphere of tension and mistrust. After Micah's tragic death, the police immediately launched an investigation to clarify the full circumstances of the incident. However, it soon became clear that it would be difficult for local law enforcement to handle the case alone due to the high publicity, pressure from Micah's family, and the numerous allegations against John Paul. The FBI was brought into the investigation. Their involvement was due not only to the increasing complexity of the case, but also to the need for an objective approach in investigating all aspects. A key phase of the investigation was the examination of the circumstances of the purchase of the weapon found near Micah's body. Investigators confirmed that the weapon was purchased by her personally on the day of her death, which was confirmed by video recordings and financial transactions. No traces were found indicating the involvement of other persons in this process. Also, the camera recordings in the parking lot of Lumber River State Park showed no suspicious vehicles or persons who could have followed her. However, the investigation went beyond confirming that Micah took her own life. In the wake of the public allegations against John Paul, the FBI began to investigate his past in detail, including his financial activities and his interactions with church members. There was evidence of possible financial irregularities. Although there were no formal charges, these facts increased suspicion against John Paul and led to further investigations. One of the most discussed topics was John Paul's possible involvement in Micah's deteriorating psycho-emotional state. Although the diary entries did not justify criminal prosecution, they raised doubts that John Paul's actions did not play a role in the tragic outcome. The investigation also raised questions about John Paul's relationships with other women in the congregation, as well as his reputation in the community. Some witnesses reported inappropriate behavior by the pastor that could have negatively affected those around him. However, there is not enough evidence for any of these allegations to hold him accountable. Until further notice, John Paul remains formally at large, although his standing in the church community has been severely shaken. He has been suspended from his position as pastor, but according to local sources, continues to receive payments from the church budget. The decision triggered mixed reactions among parishioners. Some demanded a complete separation from him. Others defended him with the argument that the allegations were not proven. This tragic story also affected the Solid Rock Church itself. The response to Micah's case undermined the credibility of the church leadership, triggered a mass exodus of parishioners, and called into question the effectiveness of internal structures. Many people who had previously participated actively in the life of the church publicly expressed their disappointment and stopped attending events. At the time of the conclusion of the investigation, many questions remain unanswered. The most important concerns the extent of John Paul's influence on his wife's condition and his possible responsibility for what happened. While law enforcement finds no grounds for charges, the public continues to follow the development of events and discuss new versions and details. This story remains painful for everyone involved and reminds us of how destructive hidden conflicts and injustices can be. Thanks for watching and take care of yourself. On a rainy spring night in the year, officers from the Scott County Sheriff's Office responded to an accident scene about 11 km north of downtown Davenport, Iowa. The driver of a car had crashed into a post. Fortunately, no one was injured. At first glance, everything looked like an ordinary case of drunk driving. But when the driver came to, the situation took a disturbing turn. At first, he was confused in his statements. But soon he remembered and told something that shocked the police officers. The 31-year-old local resident named Christopher Lee Beal could not explain where he was or where he came from. At some point, he suspected that he was in a hospital. When asked where he came from, he answered that he could remember neither his home nor his address or other places. To determine if the man had injuries, a police officer examined the interior of the car. No alcohol bottles or prohibited substances were found, but on the floor next to Christopher's feet lay a knife, which raised the alarm. He was barefoot, one of them bloody. When asked where his shoes were, the man just shrugged his shoulders. He could not remember where he came from and what he had done before the accident. While the rain pattered on the roadside, Lieutenant Leonard took the knife from the interior and placed it on the roof of the car. The blade was covered in blood, which was, however, immediately washed away by the rain. Christopher had a small wound on his side, but nothing serious. At this time, the officers assumed that he had cut himself accidentally. The vehicle registration confirmed that it belonged to Christopher Beal. The address in the papers pointed to the Crestview apartment complex in Parkwood, where Christopher lived with his girlfriend, 31-year-old Taylor Lee McCreas. The deputy sheriff named Turner drove to their apartment and knocked on the door, but no one opened. It was silent, no sound was to be heard. The attempt to reach Taylor via the found phone number remained unsuccessful. From the outside, everything looked quiet. There were no signs of disturbance or danger. Since Turner could not discover anything suspicious, he decided not to go inside and returned to Davenport, where Christopher was lying in the hospital at that time. There he was treated for minor injuries and severe alcohol poisoning. At the medical facility, Christopher was read his rights and an alcohol test was performed. For this, a special method for tracking vertical eye movement was used. In this process, the movement of the subject's eyes is observed while the head remains motionless. In the first phase, Christopher found it difficult to hold his head still, but after a few attempts, he was able to follow the instructions. The behavior of his eyes confirmed the signs of intoxication. A subsequent blood test revealed an alcohol content that was 4 times over the legal limit. Christopher showed no severe head injuries or signs of a concussion. The doctors diagnosed only alcohol poisoning, a superficial cut on the side, and a low potassium level in the body. Gradually, he began to speak more clearly, but his memory did not yet return. He could not explain how the knife had gotten into the interior of the car. He seemed to vaguely suspect that there was an explanation for it but could not remember it. When Deputy Sheriff Turner began to ask further questions about the found knife, Christopher became restless. He asked if his hands had been blood-stained when he was brought to the hospital. Most of all, he was worried by a question of whether everything was all right with his girlfriend Taylor. He claimed that she had not answered the phone at night before either, but insisted that someone from the staff return to her apartment and personally verify that everything was all right with her. Eventually, Christopher admitted that terrible images were going through his head, and he was afraid that he had done something to her. He said he did not believe he could do such a thing, as it was not in his nature. But images appeared in his head of him striking with a baseball bat. This thought triggered panic in him. He said he was not sure if that had really happened, but he absolutely wanted someone to check if Taylor was still alive. After the conversation with him, Officer Leonard drove again to the Crestview apartment complex, where Christopher and Taylor's apartment was located. This time, the officers tried to open the door of apartment number 4. It was not locked, but something prevented it from opening. When they were able to open the door a crack, it became clear that the passage was blocked by Taylor's body, which lay in the doorway. She showed no signs of life. The crime was extremely brutal. Inside the apartment, police officers found numerous signs of a struggle. Taylor had injuries caused by a baseball bat, a knife, and a screwdriver. In total, almost 60 wounds were counted. Signs of the struggle were found in several areas of the 2-room apartment, in the hallway, in the kitchen, in the living room, and finally in the area of the entrance door. On the sofa in the kitchen area lay a blood-stained bat. Next to the sink lay the broken tip of a screwdriver. The knife that had previously been secured by Officer Leonard had also been used. Although the rain had washed away some of the blood traces, DNA analysis confirmed that the blood came from Taylor. Taylor was the daughter of Michael Markey and Lisa Rosenberg. She was born in 1993 and grew up in Davenport, Iowa. She attended the local high school. After graduation, she began working in a beauty salon, initially as an assistant. Then she completed training as a manicurist. Taylor became a mother early. She had two children, Layla and Julian. However, it is not clear from available sources exactly where her children were living at the time of her death. Taylor's private life was not particularly happy. Men came and went because they could not stand her independence or, on the contrary, hurt her. Her family remembered Taylor as an open and sincere woman who could laugh from the heart, loved cooking, and cherished time with her loved ones. Despite her bright character, Taylor struggled with addiction throughout her entire adult life. During her treatment, she met Christopher. He also came from Davenport and worked on the side as a cameraman in production. They met at a rehabilitation center in Buffalo. During the program, they attended classes together, worked on overcoming their addiction, and gradually grew closer. Their relationship turned romantic. In October, they officially announced that they were a couple. After completing rehab, they moved in together immediately, but the very next day after their discharge, both started drinking alcohol again. The relationship between Christopher Beale and Taylor was not easy. It was a relationship marked by contradictions, in which love and affection were often accompanied by tensions and outbursts of aggression. Taylor told her friends several times that Christopher became very short-tempered, especially after consuming alcohol. Although he was attentive to her when sober, he lost control of himself in a drunken state, and Taylor felt like she was walking on a knife's edge. Nevertheless, she stayed with him, justifying this by saying she believed in his inner goodness, hoped for change, and was of the opinion that everyone should be given a chance. There were times when things actually got better. Christopher went to work, they planned their future together and discussed moving. But after such good phases, a renewed crash followed every time: arguments, scenes of jealousy, accusations. According to acquaintances, Christopher had a possessive character and was often of the opinion that Taylor had to submit to his will. Nevertheless, the young woman did not go to the police and tried not to carry the disputes to the outside world. She wrote messages to her friends in which she hinted at her concern but said that she would manage it. Her circle knew. Taylor was one of those people who believe until the very end that they can change the situation and the person by their side. In letters to her relatives shortly before the tragedy, she admitted that she feared for her safety but asked not to tell anyone. Their relationship was characterized by fear, hope, and inner contradictions. It was an emotional trap from which Taylor could not escape despite her awareness of the danger. Christopher Beale was born on September 5, 1993, in Iowa into a family that, as it turned out, existed only out of habit. His father worked as a welder, was often on business trips, and came back irritable and smelling of alcohol. His mother suffered from depression and spent most of her time in her bedroom, from which the sound of an old television emanated. An uneasy silence reigned in the house, which could be interrupted by screams at any moment. Christopher learned early in his childhood what it means to hide from family arguments in the closet. At school, he was a quiet, tense teenager. The teachers said he was intelligent but could not work in a team. One of them remembered how Christopher had once painted a picture in which a man was on fire but smiling. Even then, the darkness in him could be felt. In high school, he began to drink alcohol, which he had tried for the first time at 13 years old. He had stolen a bottle from his father and drunk it alone in the basement. After school, Beale tried to enroll in a car mechanic course at a college but dropped out after half a year. He had trouble dealing with the pressure and went off the rails more and more often. For a while he worked in a car repair shop, then in a warehouse and on the side as a courier. He couldn't stay anywhere longer than a few months. At one place, he was fired after an incident with a customer whom he had threatened. That was when his colleagues first suspected that he had mental health problems. The doctors diagnosed Christopher with borderline personality disorder with signs of paranoid thinking. However, he refused therapy, claiming all psychiatrists were lying and trying to get inside his head. Over time, he developed auditory hallucinations. He told that he heard his neighbors talking about him and that someone was whispering under his window at night. His relationships with women were unstable. From passion to aggression was only one step. In one of his previous relationships, according to his ex-partner, he once smashed the refrigerator door and broke the TV, only to then sit weeping on her lap and say that he was afraid of himself. When he met Taylor, she became an anchor for him. He called her his hero and said she was the only one who understood what was going on inside him. But gradually, the old pattern repeated itself. He controlled her, was jealous, checked her phone, and forced her to delete all men from her social networks. Sometimes he disappeared for several days, then came back with gifts and promised that everything would be different. Shortly before the tragedy, he lost touch with reality more and more, claimed he was being followed, and asked Taylor to cover the mirrors and not look into them after midnight. On the day of the crime, according to friends, he was quiet and withdrawn and behaved quite strangely. In the apartment where the tragedy occurred, investigators found only isolated clues that give an approximate impression of what happened in the last minutes before the brutal attack on Taylor. There was nothing unusual in the closets in the bedroom. On the bedside tables stood knickknacks and on the floor lay a bag. In the bathroom, there were no signs of cleaning. In the master bedroom, however, next to the pillow lay an almost empty plastic bottle of vodka. On the sheet, a small bloodstain could be seen, which presumably came from a touch with a finger. The cap of the bottle and Christopher's cell phone also lay on the bed. The second phone, which belonged to Taylor, was found in the kitchen. On the night of the tragedy, Taylor tried to reach two acquaintances via Facebook Messenger. The first was Michael Holland. She asked him to pick her up. This had happened before. Michael had already helped her several times. He spoke with her on the phone that night and noticed that she was emotional and had probably been drinking. He himself had also had a few glasses and therefore refused to get behind the wheel. He tried to order her a taxi via Uber, but the ride to his house would have cost $50, which was too expensive. He promised to pick her up the next morning, but she did not call back. The second message for help Taylor sent to a classmate named Nick. It was already after 11 p.m. Nick did not see the message until the morning around 7 a.m. Taylor wrote that Christopher was to blame if something happened to her. Then she added that he should not answer because Christopher was behaving inappropriately. Nevertheless, she did not call emergency services. Christopher was arrested while he was still in the hospital. After being taken into custody, he was brought to the station where he was interrogated by the police. At the time of the interrogation, he was already sober again. Without a lawyer, he began to remember fragments of the events. Within a few hours, he told two different versions. In one, he claimed that he and Taylor had been playing cards. At some point, Taylor had started acting emotional. He had tried to calm her down and they had lain down on the bed together. According to his statements, he could remember almost nothing until he had smashed the front door with a baseball bat. Christopher remembered how Taylor went into the kitchen and panicked. He did not understand what she was doing and tried to take the bat away from her. Then she ran into the living room. He remembered the further events only vaguely. He said he remembered roughly how he had taken the baseball bat and hit her. Otherwise, his memories were fragmentary. He could not reconstruct a clear sequence of events. Christopher said that after the incident, he stood there confused and considered whether he should return to the bedroom or just take the keys and leave. Christopher reported that after leaving the apartment, he could not remember anything until he woke up in the hospital. He could not explain to the investigators what exactly had prompted him to attack Taylor. According to his statements, there were indeed difficulties in their relationship. He felt that Taylor was cold towards him and gave him to understand that he was not part of her life. She had often reproached him and belittled him, which is why Christopher felt superfluous. Nevertheless, he claimed that he loved her and tried to save the relationship. The investigators left Christopher alone for a while to discuss how to proceed. His description did not match what they had seen at the crime scene. In particular, he did not mention the events in the hallway and in the kitchen, although the traces clearly indicated that the attack had begun in one part of the apartment and then shifted to other rooms until it ended at the front door. Regarding the knife, he only remembered that he had sustained a cut from it. He knew nothing at all about a screwdriver. He explained that alcohol had destroyed his life and he did not understand how he could do such a thing. Christopher remembered that he and Taylor had not been drinking together for the first time, but previously it had never come to such incidents. He was at a loss as to why everything had happened on this particular night. When the interrogation continued, the investigators put Christopher under pressure and asked him to fill the gaps in his statement. Then he began to make conjectures. Possibly after the beatings had gone too far, he had stabbed Taylor with a knife to end her suffering. He himself was not sure of this version, as his memories of that night were blurred. The investigators pointed out discrepancies between his statements and the physical evidence. Blood traces were found not only on the baseball bat and the knife, but also in other places in the apartment, indicating that the attack had taken place in several locations. Christopher could not explain why the blood was in these places. He claimed again not to remember using the screwdriver but did not rule out that it might have been used. In court, Christopher was charged with first-degree murder. To prove his guilt, the prosecution had to demonstrate that the defendant's actions were malicious and premeditated. The defense admitted the act. He had inflicted fatal injuries on Taylor. Forensic medicine determined that death had occurred due to one of the numerous blows, but it was not possible to determine exactly which one. Christopher claimed he had been in a state of drunkenness to the point of complete memory loss. The lawyers insisted that in this state he was not capable of consciously planning his actions or having malicious intentions. However, the decision on the classification of the crime was left to the jury. Although there was no evidence that he had planned the crime in advance or tried to cover up tracks, this did not mean that Christopher did not act consciously, which he was accused of. For a conviction, it was not necessary for Christopher to be able to remember the events. The number of injuries inflicted on Taylor indicated a prolonged attack, during which he would have had enough time to stop. Each injury could be viewed as a separate conscious act. The use of 3 different objects, a baseball bat, a knife, and a screwdriver, also suggested that the act was not committed spontaneously but intentionally. Although all the murder weapons were in the apartment, Christopher had to switch them at least twice during the attack. The physical evidence indicated that the incident had occurred in several areas of the apartment. The attack began in one place and continued in other rooms, which pointed to targeted actions. After the deed, he left the apartment, which indicated an awareness of the consequences. The medical examiner, Dr. Dennis Cleaney, who performed the autopsy, confirmed that the cause of death was multiple blunt force injuries. The prosecution insisted that Taylor's death was the result of the general nature of the attack. The expert could not say exactly which blow was fatal. The prosecutors drew the jury's attention to the stab wounds, especially those that, according to Christopher himself, were the last ones when he stabbed her in the chest. However, the expert pointed out that some of the injuries could have been caused by a fall. This possibility could not be completely ruled out. The analysis showed that Taylor had a significant amount of alcohol in her blood. The defense insisted that one of the first blows could have been fatal, and the subsequent injuries had no influence on the legal assessment of the incident. Therefore, in the view of the defense, the premeditation of every single act was not decisive. Christopher testified in court in his own defense. This was probably his only chance to present what happened as a tragedy caused by a sudden outburst of emotion and not as a cold-bloodedly planned act. Under oath, he changed his statement again. Now he could no longer remember using a knife. He claimed the last thing he could remember was that they had been lying in bed and talking. Previously, he had told that Taylor had allegedly grabbed a knife and injured him, whereupon he had pushed her away and taken a baseball bat. Now he denied this version completely and admitted to having invented it. At the same time, he confirmed that there had indeed been blows with the baseball bat and that Taylor, as far as he could remember, had been standing with her back to him during one of them. When asked about his confession during the interrogation that he had used a knife, he answered that he had really believed at the time that this had happened. According to his statements, he wanted to end her suffering, as he had already inflicted numerous injuries on her. In his closing argument, Christopher's lead attorney Miguel Pantes resorted to an unusual comparison again. Contrary to the prosecution's assertion that each of the nearly 60 wounds had been a separate conscious decision, the defense explained that the defendant's actions could not be divided into several episodes, but represented a single continuous impulsive behavior. Attorney Pantes ended his speech by portraying the crime as a single continuous action and comparing it to such everyday things as walking or eating. According to his words, a person does not think about every step or every bite when walking or eating. He just does it. In a similar way, according to Pantes, Christopher's actions that evening were not a sequence of well-considered decisions, but the result of a single emotional impulse in which he was immersed and which he could no longer stop. He suspected that everything had happened very quickly. According to his version, the attack began and ended in the kitchen. Pantes emphasized that there were no indications that Taylor was able to move within the apartment after the conflict began, which in his opinion indicated her almost immediate death. He also pointed out that actions committed after death cannot be classified as first-degree crimes, since intent cannot arise retrospectively. In this case, it is a different offense that was not considered within the scope of the charges. Deputy District Attorney for Scott County Brad Larson disagreed with this interpretation. He reminded the jurors that the evidence at the crime scene contradicted this version. Furthermore, the second version of Christopher's statement, which he had made during the interrogation, matched the findings at the crime scene completely. Larson reminded them that Christopher, when investigators pressured him, had confessed to possibly stabbing Taylor with a knife to end her suffering. The prosecutor emphasized that the defendant himself had said he had done this consciously, as he was aware of the victim's condition after the previous injuries. These words, according to the prosecution, were clear proof of the intent to complete the act and thus of the existence of premeditation. He asked the jurors to consider which of Christopher's versions actually corresponded to the facts. He reminded them that the first story the defendant had told had been described as fabricated by himself, while the second version, in which he confessed to using all the murder weapons, fully matched the evidence at the crime scene. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. Christopher was found guilty of first-degree murder. In addition, he was found guilty of willful injury causing serious bodily injury. The sentence for the first count automatically provides for life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The final sentencing is scheduled for May 30, 2025. It is expected that at this hearing several family members, including Taylor's mother Lisa, will comment on the consequences of the tragedy. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves.